All right, so here we are working through our Hamilton Test 304. We'll be doing the reading writing. My name is Rio. I am the humanities lead here at Hamilton Education, and I'll be discussing every single question on this test, including both modules. So stick around. You can click through and get to any particular question you might be curious about navigating through whatever video streaming service you are using to get this. And I'll be going through every single one and discussing them in a broad sense as best I can. So that's what we're working through. Test 304 here by Hamilton Education. All right, so question one here is a word in context question. It's essentially a vocab question. We are being asked to find what word is most precise and logical to fit this blank here. All right, so one thing I want us doing is making sure that we're not just plugging in these answer choices and seeing which works best. All right, I want us thinking, what kind of word do we want to put there? So when I read this passage, and I'm taking it as a given that we all read this, that underlined missing place, I'm looking for a word that says something along the lines of respect, right? The one word that shows respect here, that means respect perfectly, would be the answer, which is correct, deference. When you show deference to someone, it's a respect, you're, kind of conceding. It's a perfect synonym here for this context. However, if you're missing this question, I feel like many of us are choosing fealty. If you know what fealty is, it's like what they did in feudal times. It was like a sacred vow, but you would show your fealty or declare your fealty to typically a king or a queen or some archaic, aristocratic thing like that. So you're seeing the queen, you're like, fealty, okay? But I don't want us just taking answer choices and plugging them in. I want us to think, what kind of word would I put there? What would I put as my own word? What would I put? Respect, because that's what they're looking to show, right? Symbols of respect, mourning ceremonies, etc. That leads us to A, deference. Chagrin is kind of like frustration, right? So like much to someone's chagrin, like they don't really want something happening if they're showing that word. And then consternation is honestly fairly similar to frustration, annoyance, something like that. So these two words don't really work at all. And then fealty might sound good next to queen, but only deference shows the context and meaning that we're looking for with this question. All right, so the second question here, we have another word in context or vocab type question. Here, the test is doing something that the College Board really loves to do on the SAT, which is give us answer choices which have more than one meaning than we might typically think of. Okay, so when we read the word prompt, I'm sure a lot of us are jumping straight to one of your English or history classes. You're thinking about an essay prompt, right? Now, that kind of is the right meaning, but you're not thinking of it in the right context. All right. So the context we want to be thinking about when we're talking about, oh, it's something is, this is a prompt. It's because you're trying to be instigated, right? Which isn't maybe the natural thought there. You think it might just mean question. So we're looking, in this case, prompt means to be instigated, right? So sour candy can instigate or cause a sensory experience that momentarily grabs your attention. All right. So I'm taking it as a given that you've read this passage and you've seen the context and you're looking for something to connote that sour candy causes or creates a sensory experience that grabs your attention. Remember, I don't want us just taking answer choices and plugging them in to our missing place. I want us thinking, what kind of word do we want there? So like prompt or instigate. Okay, deploy is an answer choice that I think some of us might fall for, seeing is that it kind of sort of is a little bit close here. It's definitely not right. Okay. To deploy something means to use something, not to cause something. But using and causing, I understand to be slightly similar. Now, if you're choosing deploy, it's probably because you're not thinking of prompt in that other context, which makes it, easy to make that mistake. Subdue doesn't work because subdue means to calm something down. And then extenuate you might be thinking of the word accentuate, which is with an A. But extenuate is basically like something extended, something out, something unconsidered. You've probably heard it in the context of due to extenuating circumstances, meaning like ongoing accessory circumstances. In this case, if you're choosing extenuate, you're probably confusing it with accentuate, which means to increase something. So all those we can get rid of, and we resolve to be prompt. All right, so question 3 is one of our more straightforward vocab questions that we're going to see on the SAT here. We're basically just trying to think, what word would I put in this blank? And once you think of the word that you would put there, you want to find the synonym to that word in your answer choices. So what I'm imagining we want to say is something like abundant or substantial or conclusive, maybe not conclusive, but good, strong evidence that there's a change in climate. So ample is sufficient, right? Ample means that there's a lot of something and that it's enough and it's good. So it's very easy to arrive to ample with this question. However, I see some distractors that I understand could be kind of compelling, like grandiose. Grandiose sounds like, grande, like big, right? But when something is grandiose, it's sort of overly big, typically, right? Someone might make grandiose claims saying, if you work with me, I will get you into Harvard, MIT, doesn't matter your GPA, it doesn't matter what you've done. We will write an essay so good that you will get into those schools. Okay, those are grandiose claims. They're big, but they're kind of unsupported. Inextricable is related to whether something can be pulled apart or untangled. So you might be confusing that word with like indubitable or something like that. But inextricable here just means unable to be in like disconnected. And then contentious is something that's very debated. So is climate change contentious in some circles? Apparently so for some reason. But whether that's contentious or not in other contexts doesn't mean that word contentious, which means causing conflict, debated, fits in this particular context, right? So contentious might be something of a baggage distractor here. So all told, ample is the best answer, and that's why we go with C. Okay, so question 4 here is another vocab / word and context question. It's in the form of where you're filling in the blank, right? Choosing the most precise word, logical or precise word. All right. So this is an interesting question in that all of our answer choices, or many of our answer choices, have something to do with money. Bartering is something that we think of with economics, right? Tampering is sometimes something that is done with money or funds. But there's only one answer choice that fits the meaning and the context. Okay, so that's something that SAT likes to do. They like to give us words that we associate with a certain situation, even if the words being used don't fit. They kind of are compelling because you're like, bartering. We're talking about financial uncertainty, right? But there's only one that fits here. So grappling, I just want to describe what that means first. If I were looking at this blank and I were looking for a word to put there, I would want to say, rather than struggling with or facing, kind of like a struggle, a challenge, right? Grappling, when you grapple with something, you are ultimately working through something, considering it's some sort of challenge that you're overcoming or working through, right? So it's a little bit of a nicer word there, I think, but it means the same thing. So it comes from wrestling. In wrestling, you will grapple with people. That's when you're getting together and like grabbing one another. Okay, so fighting something. Bartering doesn't work here because ultimately bartering is something that you do between two parties, and financial uncertainty is not a party, right? It's not another individual that you would be exchanging something with. You can't really barter or exchange with financial uncertainty. Um, Tampering, it doesn't work here because tampering means to basically dabble in something. It's like a it basically um, getting your hands in and changing something. And then finally, quibbling is definitely doesn't really work here. Quibbling is usually when you ask like a small question about a small manner or a small matter, and you're making something very small out to be bigger, right? So maybe you and your team are working on a project for school, and you've been working on a lot of it, and then there's one kid who's like, I really feel like it's a problem that we're using Times New Roman. I mean, are we really going to use Times New Roman on this project? And they start like, those are quibbling remarks, right? They're very unsubstantial, kind of an irritating question. So grappling is the only one that fits the context of this and the meaning of this, even if bartering has something to do with money, right? And this whole passage is about financial literacy being taught in high school. All right, so for question 5, I want us thinking about what this should be for this word in context vocab question. What kind of word would we put there rather than just plugging these in? All right, because when we plug some of these in, they're going to be they're kind of sound okay, right? Could, for example, early dental practices be lucrative? Lucrative means you make money. Yeah, it certainly could. Could they be stringent, right? Maybe they could be stringent, right? Stringent means like they're very um, strict about something. Circumspect, maybe not so much. Circumspect is usually when you're kind of like considering something. It's kind of like almost like a sad, thinky vibe. But rudimentary kind of sounds like it might work there too. But when we read the whole context of this passage, it becomes really clear. Early teeth practices, early dentistry, didn't really know what they were doing. They lacked modern anesthetics and sterilization, and they usually were just trying to extract teeth. Um, and here we see kind of the opposite word that will help us out, right? There was a need for advancements, like we needed to get better. So rudimentary ultimately means when something is simple, right? Kind of it'd be like using a stone tool instead of a metal tool is rudimentary, right? Rather than using a tractor or a hoe to fill or dig something, you're just using a shovel, right? So rudimentary works perfectly here, kind of suggesting antiquated, out of date, and ultimately kind of simple or ineffectual. So those align perfectly, even if you might imagine, yeah, early, dentists make money, dentists are rich, or dentists are strict, right? Rudimentary is the only one that fits the context of this whole passage. All right, question 6 is a great, difficult vocab question from the SAT. This is definitely something the SAT does. They love to show you questions which use what we would call an idiomatic phrase, colloquial phrase, something that we use as a saying or everyday speech. This is a very clear word, right? To pontificate means to kind of go on and on about something, to speak at something at length with a degree of expertise. Kind of has a little bit of a negative connotation, but doesn't require one. But usually kind of you're expressing your opinion and or your thoughts, and it's kind of like, oh, you're going on and on about it. And it's sort of annoying, right? I'm pontificating right now about the word pontificate. Okay. It very often comes up in contexts of speeches or things like that. That's when we pontificate. So the other words here are probably hard to know, right? I mean, I would suppose that innovate is a word that we all know, which might be why, if you missed this question, you chose that one, right? Isn't innovation something that we do in medicine, right? And something that we do in science? Innovate sounds pretty good here. However, we have a pivot, right? We're saying that rather than continue babbling about medical concepts, she wanted to talk about her own family's journey. Okay. She is not innovating while she's talking about her research, right? Even if her research was innovative, she isn't innovating while she does it. Reminiscing is what she does in this part, right? At the end here, she kind of reminisces on some of her family's journey. However, this is connecting to the medical concepts. She's not reminiscing about the medical concepts. And excoriate, as you've maybe heard before, it's kind of a unique, not super commonly used word, but it's a pretty brutal one, right? It means you're really, really critical of something, right? It's hyper criticism. Like if you made a work of art and it's excoriated in the press, like that's not ideal. Okay, so she's not beating down and criticizing medical concepts really brutally. No, she's just talking about them at length, but rather she's deciding not to talk about them at length. Now, I would say that pontificate, this is missing a little bit of the tone of being annoying up here, which is a tone that I kind of like in the word pontificate, but it's the only one that works whatsoever. So we go with D. All right, so question 7 here is the first real reading question on this test 304. We're being asked about the main purpose of a text. So whenever we're looking for the purpose of a text we're reading, especially when it's from literature, like we see this is from a novel, we are looking for tone, we're looking for character, we're looking to use those two things to see what is the author trying to say, right? What kind of tone is the author trying to create? So we see a very, very tone-heavy passage of gloom, spectral, meaning like a ghost, squalor and misery, ghosts, ghost, 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 ghost. All right. Desolate here. Okay, we have a very particular, clear kind of tone being created by Charles Dickens here. In classic Dickensian style, he is not being subtle about it. He's really hitting us over the head with those 7 or 8 ghosts there. So the correct answer choice, we see haunting and grim, right? Spot on the nose, right? When something's grim, it's kind of serious, cold, tough, bad. Haunting is like a ghost, right? B is really on the nose, right? You have to tell that these ghosts are not real ghosts. Rather, they are the ghosts of a past and cursed society, the kind of aristocracy, right? C, again, this is taking this too literally. Is this guy really seeing ghosts? By no means. Now, finally, there are just seem to be some emotions that Darnay is dealing with, but after the loss of a loved one is something that is not clarified in here. So the only thing clarified is A, right? We see ghost a million times, it's haunting. Look for tone when you're reading these literature passages. All right, so we have another reading question here with 8. We're talking about the function of a sentence within the overall structure. So remember, we have to think about the overall structure in order to make sense of what this particular sentence is doing. All right, so what is this sentence all about? This passage all about? The creation of blue jeans and the fact that these blue jeans are a very functional invention that became a symbol of American progress and really became associated with America in many different ways. All right. So here we're learning exactly about how jeans first started from Levi Strauss. I'm wearing some Levi's right now, as a matter of fact. 501s. So he developed this here, right? And then moved on down here, we see the current context of the blue gene stuff, being kind of like a social thing. So C does that perfectly, right? We go from saying jeans were created in the 1800s at a dry goods store to jeans are something that we've loved for a long time. All right. Um, so this part is true about blue jeans, but that's not what this sentence is doing, right? We're not celebrating that functionality there. We're just saying it moves forward into here. Here, did they prove the stability of genes? No. And then finally, are we explaining this at length? No. Right, so A, B, and D all have something wrong with it, and C is all clear. So that's why we can go C. So our ninth question here is another reading style question. This is what we call a cross-text connections question. We don't have too many of them on the test. We usually have maybe one or two per test, but they're a tricky question. This one is kind of tricky because I think a lot of students come in with the preconceived notion that our texts are always at odds with each other, that they're going to disagree in some way, shape, or form. But actually, when we read these two texts, and as you'll see from the correct answer, they're in many ways corroborating each other and agreeing. Right. Passage one, now they have a little bit of a different main idea, right? Passage one is saying that like kind of history in the broader sense is something that we learn to appreciate, right? And it's kind of more of a mysterious, evocative version of history, whereas the second text says history is really important because it offers an evidential base, right? So text two is kind of more of a science version of history is important. Text one's more of a kind of like humanities esoteric version of why history is important. But in both instances, they're arriving to the conclusion that everything is a function of history, and history is very important for understanding of humanity, right? So that's exactly what we have here, right? They say that, studying history will allow us to understand it's important to understanding what humans are and how society functions. Both passages say this, and text two would respond to that conclusion like that very clearly. So do we learn anything about other fields from the second text? No. Do we say that the second text is this kind of perspective of the mysteries of chance and genius? No, that's neither of them really, but if it were to be one, to be more passage one. Then finally, so while it does say that scientific is or that history is something of a scientific field in which we look at the past as an experiment, I would say that this is too extreme, and they're ultimately agreeing in principle, so thus we choose answer choice D. All right, so question 10 here on module 1 is a pretty straightforward question. We have this line here, according to the text. This means we're dealing with the detail question. That means we're going to find something verbatim in the text that's true. So I'm taking it that we've read through this text entirely, right? And we see, some facts, right? So our fact here is that she has more nightgowns than her sister, right? How do we know that? Well, she scorches her only nightgown, and I have two. Right, so this is about her sister scorching her only nightgown. This shows that she has two, so that is true. All right. All these other things are not stated specifically in the text, simply put. So when we see a question which asks according to the text, we're looking for a direct detail. It's kind of like a, hide and seek kind of situation, pretty straightforward. All right, so question 11, we have a main idea question here. Again, fairly straightforward. So we are looking to make sense of this as a whole. So we're talking about prehistoric plants, right? So we get an example of a prehistoric plant, the cycads, and the fact that these things are too large to be carried by wind or ocean currents or birds. Their seeds are. However, how could this happen? Well, continental drift, as Pangea drifted apart over the millions of years rather, um, flora and fauna went with. Thus, they would not be as widely dispersed, are found in far-flung areas. So that's exactly that, right? Now, this is said in just the first sentence, but also this is kind of silly. This is true, but is this the main idea? No. Right? The main idea is talking about prehistoric plants in general. We're talking about cycads as an example of that. Right? And then finally, D is true in the passage, but is that the main idea? No, either. So going by main idea, we get to C. All right, question 12 here. We are looking to do a little bit of a command of evidence. So we are saying, which quotation would illustrate the student's claim? So what is the student's claim? The student's claim is that 19th century historians have inaccurately portrayed Boudica because they relied on personal accounts from Boudica's enemies. All right. So where do we see this, right? Enemy leader, exaggerated her actions, Roman sources. Perfect. All right. B is interesting because we're talking about bravery and passionate speeches, which might be connected to fierce and charismatic, but do we see the enemy accounts, right? Boudica's enemies there? No, right? C doesn't show that either. And then finally, D doesn't show that either. I think B is probably the strongest distractor here. It's pretty hard to get rid of, but when we see that it's missing any sort of invocation of Romans being her enemies, we can get rid of it. Okay, so question 13 here is a command of evidence quantitative question. So we're going to be using a graph and comparing it with, we're going to be using a figure and comparing it with text to see what we have here. Okay, so we want to complete the example. So what is our example? Nationwide 10% reduction would offset 80% of the projected rise in heart disease between 2010 and 2040. But alarmingly, a 10% population-wide increase in body mass increase would do something by 2040. So we want to show what that is. Okay, so we're going from 2010 up to 2040. And we're looking at if there is a BMI increase of 10%. As such, we are comparing that to if BMI change is stable. Okay, so if BMI is stable, there's an increase by about 0.2. But if BMI increases by 10%, it goes up by 0.4. All right, so there is a double increase in heart disease going up. We want to make sure we're comparing the right parameters. All right, so that's how we arrive to B for 13. Okay, so 14 is another reading question. This is a command of evidence textual question. So we are looking to directly strengthen the zoologist's claim. So what is the zoologist's claim? Well, their claim here is that maybe the Bushmaster has an inherent disposition for aggression, right? Meaning they are likely to be aggressive. I'm taking it as a given that you've read all this passage, okay? So what would demonstrate this strongly, that they are inherently aggressive? Well, logically, it would be attacking without needing to feed or biting other species that are not prey, okay? As such, they are now just attacking without the need for anything other than just being aggressive. Um, all these other ones don't really have to do with that. This describes what they look like. This describes if few want to eat them. And finally, this is how it will attack, which is already in the passage. So if you're missing this question, you're likely moving too quickly, or you're looking at the wrong claim, but this is the claim we need to be looking at, which connects with this very directly. Okay, so for question 15, we have a command of evidence textual question. In this case, we want to find Atwood's argument. Okay, so Atwood is a famous writer. We find her argument. So Margaret Atwood suggests that gender equality has been portrayed in dystopian fiction, right? So overall, this is talking about the ways in which dystopian fiction reflects historical, social, philosophical influences, and how this came about. But really, gender inequality is something there as well, according to Margaret Atwood. So we want to see an example of gender inequality in one of our answer choices. Okay, so this is talking about consumer culture, right? And pursuit of profit. So that's probably kind of a critique of capitalism, which is, of course, enforcing gender inequality in ways. However, we don't see it directly represented. So that's probably a baggage distractor. Again, we're talking about the Irish poor. Now, Irish women were subject to colonialism by the British. However, is it directly implied there? No. All right. Now, C, if you missed this question, is probably the answer choice you went with, because we do have some discussion of women or gender in this answer choice. However, the only answer choice that connects gender back to totalitarian author or dystopian literature is D. Right here, we see that they're enforcing rigid social structures, conferring power and authority to men, and relegating women to domestic responsibilities. Right, that is a clear invocation of gender inequality in the canon of dystopian literature. Okay, so question 16, we have an inference question. All right, so we need to be very logical here. We cannot jump to any large conclusions. We don't want to fall for any too extreme distractors. We want to stay very logically rigorous and conservative. So a couple of answer choices that are wrong, and reasons why I think you might have fallen for them. So linear A was developed after linear B, which explains why it has so many similarities to linear B. This is incorrect because we see here linear A was used in Crete. Right, by the Minoans, and then linear B was used by Mycenaeans in the Greek mainland in these years. So if you don't know how to read BCE, you might think, oh, 1900 is later than 1450, but that's not true, right? It's vice versa, right? We're getting closer to the year zero. So that's why we can get rid of A. The numbers are wrong. I'm taking it as a given that we have read this passage, by the way, seeing that we're watching this video. I would recommend you pause and reread this passage before you continue watching this video if you haven't. C, this is a plausible, but it's unsupported distractor, right? Has this been talked about in the passage? No. So they do say that they haven't yet deciphered linear A, but they haven't talked about why that has been the case, right? They don't say that linear B, which has been deciphered, is because there are more examples. We have no stated reason here as to why that's the case. All right. If you are maybe, a budding amateur archaeologist, you might know that C is true, but that would be a baggage distractor. Finally, D is a too extreme distractor, right? They'll never be able to decipher linear A, weird. And they've learned all they can from the decipherment of linear B, also weird, right? And both of those are things that are kind of too extreme of an inference to make on a SAT reading question. So only answer choice B is the one that is plausible whatsoever, right? That is supported by the passage. Linear B has similarities to linear A. It seems to be later than linear A, and as a result, probably got some of those characteristics by being from linear A. So B is the only one that's plausible. There's something directly wrong with A, C, and D. Always be deductive to get to your correct answer. And that finishes up our reading section for this first module of 304. Now we'll move on to the writing. All right, so question 17 here on module 1 is our first grammar type writing question on the test, right? So this is our standard English conventions section. So I always want us thinking about the situation and what's going on here. So we have two things going on here. We have a non-essential phrase, right? And we also have verb tense, right? So we're considering, should it be reflected or reflecting? And we're considering, should the most perfect and harmonious shape be describing reflecting what comes after, or whether it's describing the sphere as a non-essential phrase. So it is a non-essential phrase describing the sphere, right? And that makes a lot of sense because one, we can do that little test we probably learned many years ago in elementary school where you can take out the non-essential phrase and test, does the sentence still work without it? And here it does, in fact, yes, work. Why? Because the sphere or the earth is a subject, being a sphere is a subject. The most perfect and harmonious shape describes that, and therefore it's unnecessary. So he argued that the earth is a sphere, reflecting the order and symmetry of the cosmos, right? Our sentence necessities are not violated by missing this, right? We have our subject, we have our predicate, the most harmonious and perfect shape. Switched him. Does everything we need still. All right. So that means we should be going with either A or C. But no, what's the difference between A and C? Well, reflected versus reflecting. We can't go with C or D with reflected though, because here we have the present tense is, right? So yeah, he argued this in the past, but why it's a sphere is because it is presently reflecting the order and symmetry of the cosmos for his times, right? It didn't stop reflecting the order and symmetry of the cosmos. It was doing it. So that's why we go with reflecting as opposed to reflected. We get to A as our answer choice. All right, question 18 is our next standard English conventions grammar style question on the writing section here on module 1 of test 304. We have another question solely about punctuation, dealing primarily with the idea of non-essential phrases. So in this case, the names of the three inmates are not necessary in order for this sentence to work, right? When the three inmates is able to function on its own without clarifying what their names are. So that's pretty common, right? I think we all can imagine a situation where we'd say something like, yesterday I was listening to the lecture from my teacher, comma, Rio, comma, when he mentioned that non-essential phrases often come with names. Now, we're very commonly using commas to create non-essential phrases. In fact, we did that up in this question 17 right here. However, commas aren't the only punctuation we can use to create a non-essential phrase. We can also use a pair of dashes or a pair of parentheses. we just need to make sure that the first thing we use to start our non-essential phrase is the same as the end thing we use to start a non-essential phrase. So because we finish with a dash here means we must start with a dash. Therefore, we can get rid of B and D. Now, between A and C, we are thinking, okay, can we use a semicolon or a comma? All right, so what is the difference in how these two things function, right? If we're using a semicolon, everything to the left and to the right, on either side, left or right, must be able to stand on its own as a sentence, right? They must be independent clauses. So the most famous attempt occurred in 1962. Okay, that's an independent clause. However, when 3 inmates successfully escaped but were never found, is not able to stand on its own. So because when 3 inmates successfully escaped but were never found, is unable to stand on its own, we have to use a comma, right? Because ultimately that when is subordinating, and that makes this a dependent clause, and the independent clause coming first is connected to it with a comma. So that is how we arrive at C. So 19 here is just a simple tense question, okay? So we need to figure out when, where is this happening, and that by how many people, and that can kind of clarify what tense we're working with here. So as of 2020, so always remember to read the whole text because that will help you. But I'm going to presume you already read the full text, so I can just focus on the particular sentence. So as of 2023, there were, okay, so we can see that 2023, we're not in the present anymore, we're in the past. There were 45 bald eagle breeding pairs who, so had been monitored means they were no longer being monitored at that point, right? So like I had been interested means I'm no longer interested. Have been monitored means that they were monitored at one point, but maybe are no longer being monitored. Maybe they are. It's kind of unclear, right? I have been monitored, or she has been monitored. Means it's happened at some point, but it's unclear when that's happened. Who were being monitored puts us to say that at that present moment in 2023, right? This is the past still, but in that present moment of 2023, people were monitoring them. The 45 bald eagle breeding pairs were being monitored at that time. Perfect. And then D puts us in the future, saying they will one day be monitored. And that doesn't make any sense because we are in the past. So as a result, we can resolve to C. Okay, so question 20, we have a pretty interesting thing here. So we have a subject, the collector, and enthusiast, which sounds like it would typically be plural, right? But in this case, is written singular. Why is that? So typically we would expect us to say the study of stamps has been the domain of collectors and enthusiasts, right? And we might just read it naturally like that. If it said collectors and enthusiasts, we would go with A, whose expertise in stamp design and production do not uncover, right? But it doesn't say collectors and enthusiasts. It says the collector and enthusiast, which means we are singular. So when we are singular, we need to use who. Now, another thing too, right? We're talking about a people or a person here, right? People in general. Therefore, we cannot work with that, right? Here. And then finally, we have this comma here, showcasing that we have a non-essential phrase. So we need the non-essential phrase to begin with C, right? Because the real sentence is, the study of stamps has been the domain of the collector and enthusiast who do not uncover the cultural context in which these stamps were produced, right? While expert in stamp design and production is a non-essential phrase. We don't need it. Finally, who's, like that means who is. All right, that doesn't make sense. So that's why we arrive to C. All right, so 21, we have a special type of a list. All right. This is a list in which the items in the list, right, the elements of the list, several of them have a comma required for the list to function. All right. When we have that situation, we need to use semicolons to separate each item in the list from each other so that we can tell that each item in the list is the full thing. Now, why? Why are we using the semicolons? Well, because if they were commas, like we see in answer choice C here, which is wrong, we might think that the scherzo, right, we're talking about Chopin's success in larger forms, right? That would sound like he succeeded in the scherzo, he succeeded in a form he reinvented, the ballade, a genre he invented, and the sonata, right? It seems like he succeeded in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different things, right? But we want to clarify that he succeeded in 1, 2, 3 things, right? So therefore, each item in the list needs a semicolon so that we don't get confused by what those commas are suggesting. Okay. Now, as such, that means we can get rid of B and C, right? Well, actually, B does that too. So that's why we can get rid of C. Now, looking between A, B, and C, we either start the list with a colon, start with a comma, or use nothing to introduce it. So when can we use a colon to introduce a list? Because we can use a colon to introduce a list, but it must be in a special situation. Everything before the colon must be able to stand on its own as a sentence. Chopin also achieved success in larger forms, including. Because that word including is there, that word including means that we cannot have the colon, okay? If it said Chopin also achieved success in larger forms, then we would use the colon to introduce this list, right? Because then it would be an elaboration. But in this case, because of including, we cannot use a colon, nor would we use a comma. We just want to say that, right? So we need the comma before including, but we don't need it after. And we do not want to use a colon because it violates the rules of colons. So that leads us with D for 21. All right, question 22 does something that the SAT does on pretty much every test, right? Now, not this specific way on every test, but they will always show us commonly confused words and exceptions. So in this case, the commonly confused words are effect versus effect with an A, effect with an E versus effect with an A. And we are seeing it's with an apostrophe versus it's without an apostrophe. So what I'll always say for it's, wherever confused about it's, okay, it with the apostrophe S, imagine that apostrophe is a little I. Okay, to clarify that, it's apostrophe S as it is. Well, that makes sense. It is effect. No. Okay. So we can get rid of B and D. Now, effect with an A versus effect with an E, 95% of the time, effect with an A is A for action, actions equal verbs. All right. So typically when we see effect with an A, that means it's a verb because A for action, An effect with an E is a noun, meaning the outcome of something or the cause or something like that, right? Now, there are some rare exceptions. To affect change uses effect with an E. Whereas if someone has a vocal affect or affectation, that is effect with an A. Now, in those cases, effect with an A is a noun and effect with an E is a verb. But those are really, really rare. And you just need to be aware of those exceptions. Here, very simple, right? 95% plus. Effect with an A is an action is a verb, and effect with an E is a noun, meaning like the consequence of something. All right, so that's how we arrive at A, commonly confused words. All right, so 23 is a transitions question and is a great example of why we need to read the whole passage. All right, carefully for transitions especially. Okay, so this block up to right here is all saying, thank you, plastic. Right? It's saying plastic is so good. And then this chunk from here to here is saying, well, from actually here to here, right? And this chunk here is saying plastic, though, is a big problem. All right. What would we always use to transition between a pivot? We'd always use however, or some other type of pivoting transition word. If you miss this sentence, yeah, this promising material has become a symbol of environmental desecration. If you miss that sentence, you will select however. But it isn't, however. Because of that sentence, we see that instead, this sentence here is emphasizing the claim that plastic has become a symbol of environmental desecration. An emphasis is indeed. So remember, with transitions, we're always coming from our kind of category perspective, right? We want to think what type of transition fits there, and then find the word that fits that transition. Furthermore is like adding more evidence, but we haven't added any evidence yet first, so we can't do furthermore. And then because of this, we would need the evidence to come first and then the claim. Typically, and in this case, the claim is coming and then the evidence. So indeed, is providing evidence, providing emphasis. It's perfect. Exactly what we need. All right, so 24, we have another transitions question. Transitions are a logic-based kind of question, right? We need to understand the logic of a passage in order to get a correct transition. So what is the logic of this passage? So that there is a lot of biodiversity in Madagascar. It's been cut off from other land masses for 80 million years. And then something along the lines of thus, right? So we want a cause and effect type transition. Okay, so I always want us, when we're thinking about transitions, to try to consider what type of transition I want to put in that blank, right? Not just what word sounds good. I want us thinking what kind of transition. So cause and effect, or result, right? So that's what A is. It's the cause and effect, right? On the other hand, would be weighing two different things, right? It's kind of a pivot. In spite of this, says something along the lines of kind of contrasting information as well. And for example, exemplifies something, right? It emphasizes or exemplifies something. So as a result, it's the only one that's that thus type cause and effect transition. However, if we're just taking all of these and plugging them in, they'll probably all sound okay, which is probably how you would get this wrong if you miss this. But goal is to just think what category, find the answer choice which aligns with that category, and then put it in. All right, so here we have a rhetorical synthesis question here, which if you're missing these rhetorical synthesis questions, you're going to want to watch as many videos on all of these rhetorical synthesis questions as possible. But the main thing I will prioritize here is that usually we're asked only one thing from these notes. All right. So the one thing we're asked about from these notes is about the Stasi Records Agency. The Stasi Records Agency, right? So we are only being asked not about the Stasi, right? Which we get our first three basic notes are about. We're being asked about this right here. Okay. So we want to know what they're doing or yeah, what they're doing and who they are. Okay. So what are they doing? They are piecing together torn pages to allow citizens to view their personal files. All right. So that is why B is correct, because we get an introduction to who they are and what they're doing. Okay. So that's why B is correct. This, it was for, private property. That isn't correct. Now, the Stasi was destroying bags of records, but not the Stasi Records Agency. And then finally, cleaning up. It's not, even though they're in garbage bags, it's not cleanup. So therefore, that's why we get to B. All right, so 26, we have a rhetorical synthesis question, okay? Very typically on the SAT, when we have these rhetorical synthesis questions, we are not being asked about all of the notes as a whole, but asked about something specific, okay? So we are being asked just about the causes of Kasparov's decline as a competitive chess player, all right? So we learn a lot about Garry Kasparov here, right? About how good he was and why he was so successful. The youngest ever, he held it for a long time, right? But we are just being asked about the causes of his decline. All right. So where do we see the causes of the decline? Primarily here and here. So he got young, talented players he had to compete against. They offered stiff competition, and that they were using a new type of training in order to do that. All right. So what answer choice aligns with that is D, right? So we see talented younger players, new technologies, and he became less dominant. All right. Perfect. So C, even though we get compete against these people, right? One ended abruptly. Was there anything that said that it ended abruptly? We can't infer that that's true or not. I mean, it doesn't seem that abrupt. And secondly, what's missing here? Tech, right? No technology is present in C. Now, B is true, right? He did turn his attention to politics, but is this why he declined as a chess player? No, this happened after he declined. Then finally, A does a good job of summarizing these notes, but does this talk about the causes of decline? Well, doesn't say that his skills declined. It says that everybody else got new strategies. Okay, so A is kind of a reasonable but unsupported in terms of right here. B is opposite. C doesn't have everything we need. And then D has both parameters all the way, which is why we can go with it. All right, so 27 is our final question on module 1. It's another rhetorical synthesis question. If you're missing this, I suggest you watch all other rhetorical synthesis videos in our video series, because they have a very particular formula. All right. So what is that formula? Well, we want to make sure that we're focusing only on what the question is asking us to focus on, right? So we can read these notes all through, no problem. Take your time doing that. But we really want to focus on, familiar with the genre, okay? So her perspective on classical music, right? We're not summarizing all of them. We're just saying what's her perspective, okay? So what is her perspective, right? She reflects on this here, right? New approaches there, okay? So our answer choice needs to say something along the lines of that her perspective is that classical music is kind of stuffy, and she tries to overcome that through being kind of quirked up, okay? So C does that perfectly, right? We have the stuffiness and we have the quirkiness, both parameters, right? This says that she does it, right? This is a modern approach, but Does it clarify how she does it? Does it clarify her perspective? No, right? Um, A says that there's this thing here, but doesn't explain how. And then D, it says she wants to change attitudes. Okay, that's good, but then it says doesn't have any idea as to how she wants to change them or what her perspective actually is. It doesn't say that after being diagnosed with MS, she wants to make it more personal, less stuffy, right? D could suggest she wanted to make it more stuffy, right? There's nothing that clarifies what her perspective is. It just says that she has one. So C is our only answer choice, which does what we needed to do. And that ends our first module of the reading and writing. Okay, so here we are now in our second module, working through the words in context and our reading and writing. Let's take a look at question 1 here. So one thing I always want us to remember is that when we are taking a look at this, I don't want our strategy to be, let's just see which word we can plug in and have sound good, right? We want to try to figure out what word we want to put here of our own, what kind of word we want to put there based off of everything else we see through the rest of this passage. All right, so ultimately we're learning about this guy who was a forger and managed to get around the vulnerability of the art market. Okay, so there's a vulnerability in the art market and a something of expert. So I'm looking for basically the same word as vulnerability here, right? So fallibility is very good. It means the ability to fail. It's probably why this is the first question. It's pretty easy. We probably can figure that word out even if we don't know what it means. However, if we're really smart, we might look at a word like guile, right? Guile means the way it's basically kind of like a sneaky attribute, right? If you have a lot of guile, you're really good at getting around things, lying, convincing people of things. Han van Meegeren had a lot of guile, but we're not talking about Van Meegeren here, right? We're talking about the experts. Okay. Maybe he had contempt for experts by duping them so many times, but they don't have the contempt, right? And finally, acumen means they're good, right? Acumen can mean a couple different things, but basically the acumen of experts means like what they're good at. And it's clear that that's not what we're talking about here because they were fooled for many, many years. So fallibility meaning failable. That's exactly what we're looking for with question 1. All right, so question 2 here, we have some uncommonly used words used in a little bit of a different context than we typically see them. We want to make sure we're basing our analysis of this from what kind of word we would want to put in the blank, not just taking and plugging them in from our answer choices. The correct answer here, pantheon, we typically think about when we're talking about like gods from the olden days, right? Like, the Greek pantheon or the Persian or Egyptian pantheons or the Maya pantheon, right? However, it can really just mean any collection of lauded kind of heroes or figures that are very held on a pedestal. And the first 4 presidents are clearly in a pantheon according to political scientist James David Barber. Repertoire is a collection, the same way we kind of want to say collection here. It's really a collection of skills or things that you have or know, right? A singer might have a repertoire, meaning like a collection of songs they can do, or a magician might have a repertoire, meaning like a particular skills that they have. Electorate, I mean, even as we talk about elections, kind of, because we're talking about presidents, and they are in the electorate, that doesn't really make any sense here. We're trying to give them that sort of creme de la creme. Then finally, trajectory is a hard one to get rid of because, it's ultimately a sequence of things, right? However, pantheon really captures that sort of, look at these words, right? Dignity, judiciousness, reserve, dedication to duty, right? This is a laudatory thing. It's perfect for the word pantheon. Right, so question 3 here is a vocab or word and context question that does something we often see the College Board do in the SAT, which is give you a lot of words which kind of sound the same, which might be easily confused, including a couple of words you probably don't know too well. The correct word here is probably a word you don't know that word, pecuniary, right? This basically is talking about money, right? So pecuniary means it just means having to do with money. So you can kind of see how that fits, right? However, for many athletes, the true worth of a gold lies 9. It's pecuniary rewards, right? Meaning how much money you might be able to make from it, but in lifelong memories and sense of accomplishment, blah, blah, blah. All right. So you can see how that fits. But I doubt many of us are going to be able to get to that word by just knowing it. And the uh, way we get there is from etymology or roots is very uncommon, right? Pecunia is means money in Latin, but it's not the only thing I would think of as money in Latin, or like I would think of to have to do with money. Usually I'd think of like like monetize, right? Or something like that. So pecuniary, it's not one we see too often. We don't see that word showing up in money related things very often. Usually you'll see things that have to do with like capital, um, or commodity or something like that. So, but we would know what peculiar means, right? Peculiar rewards doesn't mean particular, it means kind of weird, right? Uh, unordinary. Punitive is like punishing, right? These are not punitive rewards. Scholarships, lucrative opportunities, endorsement deals, those are not punitive rewards. Finally, prudent means sensible. So if you chose prudent because you thought, oh, that kind of fits, and I have no idea what B means, honestly, you're on the right path. Okay. I would say that's not the most horrible one to miss. However, I'll remind you, pecuniary is in our vocab list. If you're missing a question like this, you had an opportunity to learn this word. And having that opportunity would have got this correct on this test. So that's what we have. All right, so question 4, we want to know the logic of this passage in order to choose the correct answer. So what is the logic, which is ultimately that dwarf giraffes are much shorter than actual giraffes. However, despite being called dwarf giraffes, they aren't actually that small, seems that they're still 9 feet tall, right? I don't think anyone that I'm, ever have taught has been close to 9 feet tall. So they're still very big, even if much smaller than their other giraffe kin. And so we're looking for something which means small, and diminutive does that perfectly, right? Um, it's diminutive means small, very small, right? So if you're choosing a word like baleful, you might be falling for you might not. If you know what baleful means, it's kind of impressive, but you might be falling for kind of an opposite distractor here because we're using negative, like almost like a double negative. They aren't exactly baleful. So baleful usually means kind of like scary, kind of menacing, or like threatening. And big things are often menacing or threatening, kind of scary, right? So you might be conflating those two things and thinking, despite their name, they aren't exactly that intimidating, but sort of an opposite distractor, right? We're trying to say, despite their name being dwarfs, they're actually kind of big, right? Skittish means likely to run away, and nascent means something that's like showing up or becoming big. Um, so neither of those really work, right? Like nascent means there's a potential, things like that. So the only one that works to mean small is diminutive. And if you're getting this question wrong, you really need to be studying your vocab. All right, so question 5, we have a question regarding a piece of literature. Okay, we have a selection from a novel. We're trying to understand the main purpose of the text. So, two things we're always going to look at when we're working with literature is character and tone. Right. So in this case, we have a lot to do with character. Right. Phileas Fogg. Um, so he dismissed James Foster because he had brought shaving water at 84 degrees instead of 86. Um, and then the successor, uh, he's awaiting him because we have hours, minutes, seconds, days, months, and years on the clock, right? This guy is humanly prompt and regular. He has very, very high expectations of his employees ultimately. Okay. Um, so that's the character, right? So sometimes we're looking at tone. That's what we saw in the previous module. Here we're looking at character. And this describes the character perfectly. We're trying to learn a little bit about who this Phileas Fogg is. Some other questions here, or some other answer choices here, right? To hint at his wealth and status through the indication of his mansion employees. Um, I That is not the case, right? Because this, you know, um, sole domestic is Phileas Fogg. He's a domestic, right? He's definitely not patient. He's waiting pretty impatiently. And then finally, there is plenty for them to do, right? So, um, as such, uh, well, Phileas Fogg isn't the sole domestic. Phileas Fogg wants his sole domestic to be superhumanly prompt and regular, right? It's not Phileas Fogg who is. But regardless, right, this is too much of a assumption here. Remember, we're starting to say conservative inner inferences on the SAT. Looking at character, we get A. Okay, so for this question here, question 6, we have literature, right, an essay. And we are looking to make sense of the main purpose. So a lot of times we're looking at character or tone. In this case, big thing is tone, right? Details give us a tone. We have multicolored plants, an oasis, right? Um, it is very convivial, right? It's very kind of nice to be, right? Men commonly talking over the noise of children playing baseball, right? Women cooking supper or gossiping in the gardens, multicolored plants, etc. Um, However, this is contrasted with scraping to make ends meet, right? Potholes and dust, time running out on you. So we have a bit of a contrast here. So B showcases that contrast perfectly, right? We see community and tranquility, but also difficulty and struggle. Perfect, right? That's the tone that we have created here. Are we overlooking the hardships? No, there's an idea of wishing you could overlook those hardships, but they're impossible. Um, Now, is this in the paragraph? Yeah, it is right up there. But it is more than this, right? We're showing the more than thisness. And then do we see individual identity here? There's no individuals brought out. So this is a really good question, in my opinion. And pretty clearly, though, should be B. All right, question 7, we have another narrative. All right, so literature in which we need to make sense of the main purpose. So what are we looking for? Character and tone. In this case, we're really focusing on the character, right? So even though we have a first person, we can make sense that we have my boy. It's high time you be doing something, right? Um, so we have a boy uh, who is going up a ladder, awe-stricken and mute, right? Clearly nervous, seemed all alone, afraid of falling, as I felt when nightmares have been upon me. To loose the main skysail, which is the highest from the deck, right? We have the other character being an old Dutch sailor. So we have all these kind of moments of apprehension. We're really trying to characterize this boy as someone who is nervous, etc. Right. So what do we see aligns with that? Answer choice B. Right. Now, even though nightmare comes up in the passage, this is actually in waking life, right? Um, does he learn different parts of the ship? Well, he's really only learning one final part of the ship here, so that doesn't work. And then finally, um, is this a revelation of how an older crew member motivates a lazy boy to complete his activities? I mean, while that sort of shows up right here, B is clearly the main aspect of this whole passage, right? So therefore, we can go with B. All right, so question 8 is a really good cross-text connections question. All right, usually we only see about one or two of these per test, maybe one per module. We are being asked to put together two different texts. So a lot of times we are under the sort of mistaken notion that they have to disagree with one another very vehemently. But sometimes they express very similar thoughts with subtle, nuanced differences, or sometimes they're in complete agreement. Here, I think they have similar topics, but ultimately have different takes. All right. Text one is really talking about how uh, morality and law or crime kind of come together, but true crime, and I'm not talking about the genre, but true crimes, real crimes, are only crimes because the law says they are crimes, right? There are things that we do which are, um, you know, not supposed to be the case, right? They are morally improper, but nonetheless, we are allowed to do them because the law hasn't made them crimes. So driving carelessly, slandering people, all these things, right? They're not criminal necessarily. Okay. Um, Whereas text two really talks about the fact that moral judgment can dissuade people from doing crimes. It isn't just kind of like particular punishments work, right? Fines seem to suggest that just buying, if you're rich enough, you can break the law, right? Unless we were in a Scandinavian country where the fine is correlated to your income, which, is all too logical for America. So now we are asked, how would the author of text two respond to the conclusion presented in text one? So what is text one's conclusion? The law, in a sense, creates the crime it punishes, right? Well, text two is saying all about the fact that punishments, right? The punishing part of this is tied to how we see it morally, right? If we want to give deeper moral condemnation for something, we want to punish it more. So therefore, A, right? That makes really good sense. Um, uh, B, there is an invocation of that up here, but does that refer to anything in the conclusion of text one? No, right? So that's a classic distractor where we'll see an answer choice that refers only to what is said in one of the texts. C, it doesn't seem to be powerful enough. And then finally, D, it doesn't seem to be suggesting up here that there is no definition for crime, and nor does it seem that text two would take a strong claim on that, right? You might infer that their vibe would suggest they would choose D, but remember on the SAT, we're trying to be very careful in our assumptions, right? And you cannot make the assumption of D based off of the text. You could jump to that conclusion, but that's going far too far. So as such, we will resolve to A for question 8. All right, so question 9, we have an excerpt from literature. So we have a novel here. We want to do two things. One, we want to focus on character and tone. So we learn a lot about Rask and his employees here, right? And we want to focus on the fact that this is a detail question, meaning that our answer choice is going to come verbatim from the text, basically, right? So Rask, he really doesn't want any highs or lows, right? Conversations are in whispers. The creaking of leather or rustle of a silk sleeve could be heard in the opposite end of the room, right? Unless they had vital information, they waited to be spoken to. So there's a kind of silence, quiet intent, right? They don't want to disturb Mr. Benjamin Rask. So that is the detail that appears in B. They were not indifferent to his needs and focused on their own goals. No, they were very, very focused on his needs, right? So A is an opposite distractor. C, there's no superiority clarified here, right? They're trying to be very quiet. And then D, it does seem that they do want to learn more from him, but vying for his attention means that they're competing for his attention amongst one another. And is there any suggestion that they are competing amongst each other? No, right? That isn't brought up. So if we didn't know what this word vied means, right, because of vocabulary, meaning you need to study vocabulary, I can see choosing D, but D, once you know what that word means, you see, there's no competition here. We have to go with B. All right, so question 10 here, we have a command of evidence textual question. So we want to determine whether, how we can weaken the student's hypothesis, right? So our hypothesis is that the New York Times has become increasingly difficult over the course of the week, right? So from Monday to Sunday, the crosswords become more and more difficult until the Sunday crossword is the most difficult crossword. So what would best weaken this hypothesis? Well, we would want to see that people are maybe better later in the week than they are earlier in the week, right? So increasingly difficult means each day needs to be a little more difficult. It's not saying that Sunday is harder than Monday. It's saying that it gets harder each day as the week goes on. That's why progresses is important. So C shows that very clearly, right? 58% were correct on an early day, 67 were correct on a later day, right? That would very clearly weaken her argument of the opposite. D supports her argument, perhaps, talking about difficulty. B really clearly supports her argument, and A supports her argument, right? So we need to focus on the fact that we are weakening her hypothesis to arrive to C. This is a really straightforward question. This is definitely one of the easier ones on either module of this test. If you're missing a question like this, you really need to just stop, pause, make sure you're reading something all the way through. If you do that, this should be a pretty straightforward question to get correct. All right, so with question 11, we are looking to strongly support the scholar's claim. All right, that means we have a command of evidence question in the textual side of the command of evidence. So how do we want to focus on this? So what is the scholar's claim? Scholar studying fish asserts that lateralization enhances behaviors that ensure species survival. Right, so a couple of things that we need to know from the passage. Pause right now and reread the passage if you need to reread it. So lateralization is handedness, basically one side or the other, using one side or the other. So it has costs and benefits. So studying fish, they say that lateralization helps them survive. So we want an answer choice which shows that somehow lateralization makes them more likely to survive. So here we have D saying that clearly, right? So lateralization helps them keep better track of their group, potential threats, and other stimuli simultaneously, right? This seems to help their survival. C is an opposite distractor, right? So in low predation regions, they had more lateralization than high predation regions, right? That's an opposite distractor. We would want to see the very opposite for this to support the scholar's claim. A is ignoring lateralization entirely. So A doesn't make any sense. And then finally, B is a opposite distractor. So this clearly shows the costs, perhaps, of lateralization, but it doesn't show the enhanced survival. So that's why we can get rid of B. So make sure you're reading this passage and understanding this passage. I'd pause, reread it, make sure you understand what cerebral lateralization is, why we do it then in our body, right? Preferring one side to the other, and what it would mean for ensuring species survival, right? Just beneficial traits. Okay, so 12 is one of our more interesting command of evidence textual questions in that we are working from a basically piece of literature from classic American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson, right? So we want to find his claim, right? We want to illustrate the claim. So the first thing that we need to know is understand what his claim is. So his claim is that greatness comes from following one's own path. So following yourself and trusting your own new intuition to freely navigate society. So using you to navigate society, trusting your own intuition to navigate society, right? So we need an answer choice that says follow your own opinions and use that to be free of other things. Okay, so here we have suffrage of the world, right? This means freedom of the world, right? Nothing is more important than the integrity of your own mind, right? Integrity means its ability to stand on its own, right? When a building has integrity, it stands on its own, it's believable. Absolve you to yourself, okay? That means basically put yourself as your ultimate focus or, ultimate goal. And you shall have the freedom of the world. Okay, so this does a really good job of explaining, of connecting to this claim, right? So A talks about, doing good work, right? You feel really good when you've done good work. That you might, follow some weirdo bros on YouTube who are like, the way to be freedom is, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But this doesn't connect to here directly whatsoever. So you can get rid of A. And then D says ultimately, right, you want to be constantly pushing yourself forward by, having these sort of like hard conversations, hard thinking. Doesn't have anything to do with society, anything to do with intuition or anything like that. It's a very it is individualistic, but it doesn't consider society or navigating society in the way that B does. And finally, C, we talk about society. Good. We talk about how there's conspiracy against the kind of individuality of its members and the fact that they want conformity. That all kind of connects very implicitly to our claim, but B more clearly connects to our claim, right? Remember, we don't want to infer something kind of, by jumping to a conclusion. We want to infer something that is so directly stated in the text that it is irrefutable. B does that perfectly, and that's why we can resolve B. Okay, so 13, we have a command of evidence quantitative question. So we're going to be taking our graph, connecting it to a claim that is made in the text. So we are looking for Kiefer and Kneizer's suggestion, right? So what do these two K-named people say? Well, they suggest that higher team salary caps and player salaries have incentivized players to take more risks and therefore getting more concussions, right? So let's see if that is borne out in the data. So as concussions kind of generally speaking are going up, though there are some outlier years that are even higher. And generally speaking, as team salary and player salary go up, concussions go up, though there are a few exceptions, right? So we're going to look for an answer choice that doesn't have anything wrong from the data. One thing that the SAT loves to do is they love to show you an answer choice that would be correct if it was correct, if the data supported it, but the data doesn't support it. So, for example, 2012, all right, that indeed is the average highest salary. Actually, no, it's not. The average highest average salary was a different year, right? So that shows that A can't be correct because we see that 2010 is higher than 2012 in terms of salary per player. Okay. So lowest team salary cap being in 2001. Well, that also isn't true, right? So even though 143 is the lowest number of concussions, 2001 is actually a higher salary cap than it was in 2003. Now, C, we see that concussions and average salary increase over a certain period of time. Let's look from 2003 to 2006. It goes up, 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 up. Okay, good. And from average salary, we see that it's going up, 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 up. Good. Okay. That is what we need to see right there. All right. And then finally, the salary cap changed from 2006 to 2007, yes, but it went up. Okay, so that would weaken Kiefer and Kneizer's suggestion. So as such, we have to resolve to C. All right, so question 14 is our final reading question on this test. We have a command of evidence quantitative question, meaning we're going to put this graph in dialogue with this text and discussing a student's conclusion. All right, so what is the student's conclusion? Ultimately, the student is suggesting that a decrease in ocean surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean always, not a good word to use in hypothesis, leads to an increase in tornadoes in Tornado Alley. So what we want to do is contest this. Okay, so if you're missing this question, you might not know what it means to contest something. That means to go against, make it to challenge it ultimately. All right, so what we want to see is a decrease in ocean temperature not leading to an increase in tornadoes in Tornado Alley. All right, so 2016 to 2017, right, we have a very serious decrease in temperature and a very serious decrease in the number of tornadoes. All right. So even if maybe typically when the temperature drops in the Pacific Ocean, you have more tornadoes there. That is not the case for their claim, which uses the really bad always. Okay. That is the key thing to notice there, right? So even if their general idea is correct, generally speaking, when temperatures go down, it looks like tornadoes increase. It is not wise to say that it always happens. All right. 2019 to 2020, temperature actually increased. Okay, so they are not saying that the inverse is true. They're just saying that a decrease in ocean temperature leads to an increase in tornadoes. Right. So we don't need to look at the opposite. We just need to look at when temperatures are going down. Increase in tornadoes from 2014 to 2015 is true. And there was a decrease in temperature, but that would support their claim. We're looking to contest it. And then finally, 2018 to 2019, there was not a decrease in tornadoes. There was an increase in tornadoes. So 2016 to 2017 is our best example to contest their very poorly worded claim of that they always lead to an increase in tornadoes in Tornado Alley. So with that, we come to the end of our reading section here and move on to our final writing portion of test 304. All right, so question 15 here, we have our first grammar style question of the second module here. Basically, we have a tense question, right? We have, very simply, we need to, even though this is taking place in the past tense, we cannot use the past tense here. Why can't we use the past tense? Two photos appeared on the screen showed, right? This is our past tense, right? This needs to show what was happening at that time in the past while it was presently happening in the past, right? So that's why it's B. Now, we could have used a which. That would have been okay, but this comma here is what makes that wrong, right? Two photos appeared on the screen which showed the Space Needle in large pieces, right? We can't, what would that comma be accomplishing? Showed on its own doesn't work, right? So that's why we have to go with B. All right, so question 16 here on module 2 is simply a lists question. But the items in the list are just long, right? So one item in the list is regarding the composition of comets. The next item is the distribution of organic compounds in our solar system. And the final item in the list is the origins of life on Earth. All right. All three of those items in the list are pretty long, right? However, it doesn't matter if they're long or short, so long as there's no comma necessary to the items in the list. We just use commas to separate them. So A makes a mistake by using a semicolon, right? That would suggest that everything after the semicolon could stand on its own, or that we had items in a list which need a comma. No there. Now, this colon, we can use colons to introduce a list sometimes, or to introduce an elaboration. But everything coming before the colon has to be able to stand on its own. And here, even though it sounds like it could stand on its own, what the composition of comets isn't explained, isn't like a term that needs to be explained by the distribution of organic compounds in our solar system and the origins of life on Earth, right? Those things aren't elaborating on what the composition of comets is. Rather, it serves as just another item in a list. So that's why we go with B. All right, so 17, we have a pretty straightforward non-essential phrase question with an element testing how well do you actually know what non-essential phrases need, and basically like trying to identify if you're commonly doing too much, as we might say. So our correct answer is C, because amoris Crowley isn't necessary for the sentence, right? Her car was later found abandoned with her fur coat and driver's license inside is all we need for that clause to work, right? So C, you get rid of Morris Cowley because it's unnecessary, but you might want to leave it in the sentence as a whole, so you put it within the pair of commas. Now, why can we not do B? So a semicolon would suggest that everything before the semicolon could stand on its own as a sentence, and everything after the semicolon could stand on its own with a sentence as a sentence. So while her car was later found abandoned could stand on its own as an independent clause, with her fur coat and driver's license inside is something that needs to be connected to the car, right? There is no subject in this. So with no subject, we cannot separate it out. D, we're using a dash for some reason. It's really accomplishing nothing there, right? Unless you were trying to create a non-essential phrase. Now, why is with her fur coat and driver's license inside not a non-essential phrase? Why is it needed? Well, it's describing the state in which the car was abandoned, right? By using with, we are saying that this is all part of the same thing, right? If we were to say my teacher taught grammar and vocabulary today, right? Even though my teacher taught can stand on its own, and we don't necessarily need vocabulary and grammar today in order for the sentence to work, that describes what the teacher taught specifically. It's describing the verb in the sentence, the predicate. So this is all part of that, right? Therefore, we cannot separate it out with another non-essential phrase. So there should be no comma after abandoned. We go with C. So 18, we have a pretty straightforward question using a little bit of verb tense and a little bit of punctuation. So tense, we have will become is in the future, and we are talking about it beginning in 1897 and existing still today, right? We don't know that it is a celebrated tradition already, okay? We don't know that it will become one in the future. It is one already. So we can get rid of C and D because it will become. So now we have has become. The difference is, do we say over the years is a non-essential phrase or not? It's a non-essential phrase, right? It's serving almost as a transition here. All we need is it began in 1897 and has become a celebrated tradition, drawing elite athletes and amateur runners from around the world, right? So for B, we can get rid of it because we need that comma after over the years, because over the years is a non-essential phrase. It's not a part of our subject or predicate. So we'll go with A for 18. All right, 19 is a tricky one, and I'm sure some of us have some questions. Okay, let's get rid of what's wrong. All right, first, why can we get rid of D? D would be okay. It created in 1916 if this was a comma, creating the National Park Service to oversee the protected areas, right? Creating is a subordinating term. As such, it is a dependent clause, but we cannot connect a dependent clause to an independent clause at the semicolon. All right. Now, C, by using that created, we are making an independent clause. By making that independent clause, we cannot connect it with just a comma, right? That created the National Park Service to oversee the protected areas as an independent clause, because that is not something that we would use in a non-essential setting, right? So because it's essential, meaning it's an independent clause, we cannot connect it with just a comma. We would need a semicolon. All right. And then finally, A, we can get rid of because there is no comma, right? We need a comma there because this which created is like a non-essential kind of dependent tack on. You can't do that without a comma. So B works great. We have our comma going into our subordinating with a transition. That's perfect, right? Works out perfectly well. Remember, not every transition needs to be at the beginning of a independent clause, right? It's really just saying 1916, creating the National Park Service, right? We don't even need that thus, but it's fine being there. So that's why we go with B. We have basically a dependent clause attached to an independent clause, which we can only connect with a comma. All right, so 20 is an interesting one here because we have two answer choices which produce the right thing. Okay, so what we are looking for is an elaboration, right? This part of the sentence is explaining what comes before it. Everything that comes before it can stand on its own as its own sentence, but we would just want to tack something on to clarify or add some information. We always will use one of two punctuation marks, a dash or a colon. So both A and C do the right thing, but C has the wrong tense. Where similar attractions would be built, why are we in the subjunctive here, right? Why are we in a hypothetical thing? They're not hypothetical. They were, in fact, built. This is something that factually happened. So that's why we can get rid of C. D, remember, when we have a semicolon, what comes to the left and what comes to the right must both be able to stand on their own. And where similar attractions had been built in the winter months, doesn't stand on its own. And then finally, we can get rid of B because we have are built, right? Which is the present tense, and this is something that happens in the past. So with A, we have our dash to create an elaboration. Perfect. We have were to show that we are in the past tense. Perfect. With both of those things, we can know that A is correct, and we have reasons for why B, C, and D are all incorrect. All right, so for the first part of 21, we want to think about between A and B and C and D, we have it apostrophe S and it S with no apostrophe, okay? If we can get rid of whether it's or it's with the apostrophe, we can narrow our focus down to two. So remember, it apostrophe S equals it is. Imagine the apostrophe is a very small I. Okay, so it is doesn't work here, right? It is reflections. That doesn't make any sense. So now we are between B reflection apostrophe S or A reflections, right? So reflections like that is just plural, which is good, right? The book has more, or the book has more than one reflection. It has more than one reflection of Shelley's concerns. Okay. B says that we have one reflection, and then that reflection is possessing something. And that's not the case, right? We just want to say that there was more than one reflection. There's no need to have possession here. It's not possessing anything. Therefore, we can get rid of B, and its is why you can get rid of C and D. It's not it is the possessive its. So therefore, we go with that. All right, so 22 is a little bit of a tricky one here, which is very good. Okay, it's a very good SAT style question. So let's remember, what do we need here? So we have one independent clause. Nixon allegedly played 30 games in a row. Then we have another independent clause. The press reported his high score to be an impressive 262. Right? So these are two clauses. How do we connect clauses, independent clauses? These are two independent clauses, here and here. How do we connect two independent clauses? Well, we can use either a semicolon, a comma to fanboys, or a period, right? So the comma is coming after the fanboys, so that's no good. And D has no comma, so that's just a run-on. So neither B nor D work. So now we're between A and C. So what's the difference, right? The difference is that this section here, although his average is said to have been a closely guarded state secret, is a non-essential phrase, right? Do we need that caveat in order to know what his high score was? No, not at all, right? So because we don't need that, we can go ahead and make that a non-essential phrase, right? A suggests that this is another part of the sentence that needs to be there, but that is not the case. It is a non-essential phrase. Why? Because Nixon allegedly played 30 games in a row, independent clause. The press reported his high score to be an impressive 262, independent clause. In between, non-essential phrase. All right, so 23 is our first transitions question on module 2. I always want to remind you that with transitions questions, we want to think about what kind of category of transition fits in our blank, okay? I don't want us just taking our answer choices and plugging them in and see which one sounds good, right? Because if we do that, something else might sound fine because typically transitions kind of sound good. They pass the ear test. Remember, the test is never asking us, which of these answer choices sounds good to you? They're asking which one hits the logical sequencing, right? So what kind of logical sequencing do we need here? What kind of transition category do we need? We need a evidence one, right? We are providing evidence right afterwards. Okay, so we're exemplifying this. What exemplifies here? For instance is an exemplifying one, right? Of course, usually it's sort of a concession or sometimes comes up as emphasis, but doesn't exemplify. Moreover is kind of building on something. So you're giving new information with moreover. A lot of times it's giving a second line of evidence after already having given a first one. And then accordingly is usually cause and effect, right? So we would say, so, there's first this claim. Accordingly, we see AYZ as our evidence, okay? So for instance is the only one that exemplifies what comes beforehand. And here we're saying, for instance, we're providing an example of somebody who, like in Nick, Finding Nemo, is good at escaping from aquariums. So that's why we'd go with B. All right, so 24 is a transitions question. If you missed this question, I would suggest you watch my explanation for question 23, which goes over how we generally approach transitions questions, meaning we don't just take our answer choices and plug them in, we look for the category we want. All right, so what category do we need here? We need a contrasting category where it's like yet, however, okay? By contrast is the clearest contrasting category there is, all right? For example, would be if this system was after the fact that they say that the imperial system doesn't work, right? For example, provides an example of something. In fact and for example are pretty similar, except in fact is usually more emphasis. And then furthermore is a cause and effect type situation, or it's building on something, right? So furthermore means we're giving another example. So usually it'd be the second of multiple examples on the same topic. The reason why furthermore doesn't work here is because this is describing the imperial measurement system, right? And the previous example, about 1 kilogram, etc., is describing the metric system. If we were describing the metric system still here, then we could use furthermore, but because we pivot, we need a pivoting transition, which is by contrast. All right, so question 25, we have a transitions question. If you missed this question, I would suggest you watch the videos for question 23 and maybe 24 to see the overall strategy for approaching transitions, which is we want to think of what category of transition we want to place in that underlined area, the missing filled in portion. We don't want to just take our answer choices and plug them in and see which one we like the sound of most. That's going to lead us to make an error. So what we need is an emphasis or exemplifying transition category. The one that's in that category is in fact, and that's why we go with it, right? However, and nevertheless, basically mean the same thing. They both are pivoting, right? Because they are pivoting, that doesn't make sense because this is exemplifying what comes before, right? Then therefore is a cause and effect, but this cause and effect is an example where something explicitly causes what comes next. Whereas here, by exemplifying or emphasizing this claim isn't being proven with this, it's just being demonstrated, right? If we're demonstrating, we would use something like in fact or indeed or what have you. If we are, or for example, we are proving something, the connection, then we might say something along the lines of thus, therefore, as such, right? So they're different categories, therefore they're not the same, simply put. Okay, so question 26 is a rhetorical synthesis question. If you missed this question, I'd suggest you watch the wide variety of rhetorical synthesis videos that we've made for this test and for other tests, because there's a specific strategy you want to get really good at. Okay, strategy being you read the notes and then you say, okay, what exactly do I need? Because they're not asking about everything. So they're asking about only one parameter, which is why are we using amphibians to study environmental health, right? So all of this stuff describes amphibians, but why are scientists so interested in them? Well, according to these notes, right, they are exposed to a wide range of environments because of their type of life, and because scientists, because they have persisted for so long, they give us a better understanding, right, of current environmental health. So there's a diversity of food predators and parasites. They're sensitive to temperature changes. Okay, so all of these are reasons as to why. So anything that talks about all of those will be good. Okay, let's see what's wrong. Is this said? Sure, it's said there. But is that why? According to the passage, does that align with this? No. Okay. And we're going to see. Might this be true? Sure, it could be true. It's rational. But is this supported in the passage here? It's not in the passage. Then finally, D, even if this up here might be true, that's not why they're interested. Why are they interested? These three notes. So B says, here are the notes. One, right? One, many types of habitats. Two. Three. By doing that, showing all three reasons that scientists like it, B is our good answer. And with that, we come to the end of test 304. Hope you enjoyed it. Okay, so I realized on question 26, I may have said that that was the last question on the test, but I forgot. We actually have question 27 here in module 2. I was a little hasty to finish up. So we are being asked to describe the Roebling Bridge to an audience familiar with the Brooklyn Bridge. All right, so we want to use what describes the Brooklyn Bridge in order to compare it to the Roebling Bridge. So what does the Brooklyn Bridge have? It's Gothic inspired, intricate stone masonry. We see that they both feature a suspension design, and that at the time of its completion, it was the longest suspension bridge. And ultimately that this guy, when he built it in the Ohio River in Cincinnati, he then also built it in New York City. All right. So how can we actually compare them? Well, length is one way. So we'll want to bring that up and how they look a little bit different and their different purposes. We need to describe the Roebling Bridge. So what it looks like, what it functions as, where it might be, etc. So A, it compares the two, right? But does it say anything about what the Roebling Bridge, does it describe the Roebling Bridge at all? No. B, however, we describe the Roebling Bridge compared to the Brooklyn Bridge, right? Which we assume that our audience knows. So we kind of get an idea of what the Roebling Bridge looks like. And we get an idea of its length. So there's a description and it's compared to the Brooklyn Bridge. Perfect. Right. C, do they have very similar intricate architectural features? Actually, no. That's a classic example of the SAT throwing a distractor where there's an answer choice that uses information that isn't actually in the text. And then finally, while this is true, right? That's good that it's true. Does this describe the Roebling Bridge? Not really, right? We wouldn't know if the Roebling Bridge was looking anything like the Brooklyn Bridge or not. So that is why we will resolve to B and now actually finish up this test.